Good morning, students. In this class, we will go into the finer details of the poem titled Background Casually by Nissim Ezekiel. In the last class, I gave you a line by line explanation of the poem. Hope it is clear. So today, we will look more into this poem. Nissim Ezekiel's poem, Background Casually, is one of his most known poems. And the poem's significance lies in the fact that it is an autobiographical poem which is seen to indicate crisply his official view of life, as it were. And Ezekiel's general tendency in his poem is to be more communicative than be imagistic, which is also evident here. Similarly, the ironic tone swings between whipping the self and the society, which is which we see abundantly in this poem. The ironic tone which swings between whipping one's own self and the society. So even we can note the irony inherent in the very title, the word casually. As you know, it suggests a casual treatment of the subject, and therefore this poem is not consciously selected biographical details. It is not consciously selected or even presented. So, some of the recurrent motives of Ezekiel's poetry, as we see in this poem, include finding satisfaction in limited ambition, that is where he reaches, and then he gives out a set of experiences stated as providing deep insight. So he narrates us a list of experiences he goes through which provide him deeper insights, deeper understanding of his own identity. And we see the use of unrhymed metrical lines. Also, there is this probing the question of identity in a firm social context. And we see there is this controlled fragmentation which is unlike the modernist tendency of obscurity. Therefore, this poem, which is divided into three sections, which talks about childhood, adulthood, and old age experiences, do not merely present a chronology of significant experiences, but it is a kind of reflection of these experiences that draw out lessons on the status of the identity of the self. Look at the first stanza. A poet rascal clown was born, the frightened child who wouldn't eat or sleep, a boy of meager born, he never learned to fly a kite, his borrowed top refused to swing. So here the first line is the present valuation of the past. Is the present valuation of the past. There is this self-perception of the speaker as a poet, and the self-perception of being a poet is immediately attached to an irony with the addition of rascal and clown. From irony, this present perception of the past slides into some kind of self-pity, which is a kind of a clever ploy he employs, clever technique he employs. He constantly uses this technique of this he constantly uses this element of self-pity. He says this boy of meager bone with not who doesn't even know to fly a kite, who is not destined to achieve anything too noble. So here we see this element of self pity coming into the fore. And here the poet warns the reader to agree that this boy of meager born has not done anything noble. And then we note this irony of being branded as an enemy of Christians, winning this prize in a Bible competition, in a scripture prize. And we see Ezekiel's sensitive reaction to bad English, which is always seen in his poems. So, here in these first stanza, we see this self pity, which later move into a kind of self awareness. Self pity, which moves into middle state at a self alienation, and later, finally, he moves into self discovery, self awareness. Coming to the second stanza, I went to Roman school a mugging Jew among the wolves. They told me I had killed the Christ. That year I won the scripture prize. A Muslim sportsman boxed my ears. I grew in terror of the strong but undernourished Hindu lads. Their propositions always wrong repelled me by passivity. One noisy day I used a knife. At home, on Friday nights the prayers were said. My morals had declined. I heard of yoga and of Zen. Would I perhaps be Rabbi seen? The more I searched, the less I found. So, as I said earlier, in the second stanza, it slips from third to first person. And then there is this, in the second and third stanza, the multicultural mix of the society in which the speaker has grown up is introduced again through this ploy of self-pity. And these two stanzas insistently introduce the major strand of the theme of the poem, that is identity. It is these two stanzas which reveal the major idea of the poem, that is identity. He says there is this challenge to coherent formation of identity, which is indicated here as related to the mixing of cultures that are not devoid of intolerance towards one another. While the poet or the narrator feels strongly this alienation, isolation caused by being a Jew among the Hindus, Muslims, Christians, he feels much more isolated from his own self. He even feels isolated even at his home. So he is unable to discover himself and his place both at home and outside. So there arises this challenge against this formation of identity. He feels as isolated from the society and also from himself. So there is a movement from what is known as self-pity to self-alienation. So this self-alienation is something, firstly it is self-pity and then transition to self-alienation. So these are the elements which ultimately prepare him for a journey towards self-perfection or something like self-discovery. So he sees that the base of this incoherence, is made more unstable by all those yoga, Zen, and Jewish theology. He says The more I searched, the less I found. He talks about his identity becoming more and more fluid. Whenever he searched for more, he became more unstable. Next answer, he says 22, time to go abroad. First the decision and then a friend to pay the fare. Philosophy, poverty, and poetry, three companions shared my basement room. So here he talks about the common event where all these Indians go abroad. So it is treated in an ironic manner. And there is also a metaphoric suggestion that to Ezekiel, this was the beginning of a long, long journey in this quest of self-discovery. As I said earlier, this poem completely avoids this leisurely presentation of biographical details and only highlights whatever is, is considered to be the most important and memorable in in the narrator's life, just like quick flashes. That is why we see that these stanzas squeeze a long duration into rapidly moving lines. 22, time to go abroad, first the decision. So it is moving in a rapid manner. And along with that, we see this intimations of failure which is around the corner in his which you see in all his autobiographical poems. The As I said earlier, it squeezes a long duration into rapidly moving lines, and growing up amid all these different influences, the speaker expands the base of this incoherence of his identity to include yoga, Zen, and Jewish theology. So his incoherence of identity is more widened by adding up all these other streams too. And he uses this alliterative line philosophy, poverty, and poetry. So here he is presenting the personal experiences philosophically to produce a kind of poetic significance. In these lines, the London seasons passed me by. I lay in bed 2 years alone. And then a woman came to tell my willing ears I was the son of man. I knew that I had failed in everything, a bitter thought. So, in an English cargo ship, taking French guns and water shells to Indochina, scrubbed the decks and learned to laugh again at home. So, here begins the second section of the poem, which brings in adult experiences as suggested toward the end of the previous stanza. So, from the previous stanza itself, there is this hint of adult experiences. And here, these stanzas introduce the summary dismissal of the self that recurs in Ezekiel's poems. Here we find that the sense of failure is recurrent. That is why he says, I knew that I had failed in everything, a bitter thought. And it is said that Ezekiel usually positions these statements strategically in his poems. In his poem, and it is said that the function is not to state to the reader the sense of speaker's disillusion. Actually, these lines are positioned by Ezekiel in such a way to to herald or declare the experiments that lead the self towards this present significance. So he presents this sense of failure, or he usually positions this idea of failure strategically in his poems, so that the reader enjoys this journey towards self discovery, a kind of achieving victory at the end. And this stanza also indicate the speaker's decision to turn away from all those metrocentricness of this colonial mentality. Here, along with that, there is an ironic reference to the poet's sexual isolation, which is always a recurrent theme, a recurrent subject in his poetry. And he says a woman seems to have redeemed him from his sexual frustration by making him feel important. But even that affair seems to end in a failure. So there is this element of pathos in these lines. I knew that I had failed in everything. And then he comes to the next stanza. How to feel at home was the point. Some reading had been done, but what had I observed except my own exasperation? All Hindus are like that, my father used to say. When someone talked too loudly or knocked at the door like the devil, they hopped and spat, they sprawled around. I prepared for the worst, married, changed jobs, and saw myself a fool. The song of my experience sung, I knew that all was yet to sing. My ancestors among the caste were aliens crushing seed for bread. The hooded bullock made his rounds. So there is this lasting question, something that has characterized Ezekiel's approach generally is this line, how to feel at home. So, how to feel at home is a question raised by many of Ezekiel's poems about identity. He makes out a case for homely feeling as a measure of identity. He tries to present that it is homely feeling which gives fixture to your identity. And with this homely feeling comes a responsibility. With homely feeling comes a responsibility, because for Ezekiel, this responsibility requires that one not only see one's home in appreciation, but also with a certain critical distance. So here, Ezekiel felt most intensely the need to belong, but finds that he cannot feel at home anywhere, either in England or in India. And this is the usual motive you see in all those diasporic writers, the treatment of the element of being in a state of exile. You see this element in diasporic writers like V.S. Naipaul. And the manner in which Ezekiel frames the identity question is apparent, is very much evident here. He makes out a case for homely feeling, as I said earlier, he makes out a case for homely feeling as something like a measure for identity. And he takes this line from Blake, the song of experience. So here, experience includes his marriage, his change of jobs, and later this realization that he has been a fool. So all these change of identities, all these experiences, all these set of experiences only aggravated his identity crisis. And he says, my ancestors among the caste were aliens crushing seed for bread. So this line refers to the narrator's choice of the profession, occasion of a poet breaking from all those ancestral profession. They had this oil pressing as their profession. So the tradition that ancestors took to did this oil pressing. So he also had this guilty feeling of leaving his ancestral profession too and taking up a challenging profession of a poet. And then he continues, One among them fought and taught, a major bearing British arms. He told my father sad stories of the Boer War. I dreamed that fierce men had bound my feet and hands. The later dreams were all of words. I did not know that words betray, but let the poems come and lost that grip on things the worldly prize. I would not suffer that again. So here in this section, in this third section, he swiftly moves on in life. Here the speaker is mature. He is ripe. He has gone through different experiences, different set of experiences, which is mostly uh, mostly a kind of uh, brought a kind of disillusionment in him. So he is ripe with his experiences. So now he can ripe with his experiences. He had all these experiences. So now he can give out his conclusions, and that is within the poem. The narration of experiences is now over, and it is now time to draw out all those philosophical implications, all those coming to the conclusion. The later dreams were all of words. So here he picks up the theme of poetic career. The poem now becomes poised, become calm. So here, till now, he was going through all those rough waters, describing all those traumatic experiences of being in a minor, for coming from a minor community, and his own alienation with his own self. But here, from here on, we see a kind of a poised attitude. This poem becomes poised to give us a peep into the poetic process. He gets a grip. He says, let the poems come and lost. I would not suffer that again. So he attains a state of calmness. He is slowly reconciling with his own identity, we see. He continues, I look about me now and try to formulate a plainer view. The wise survive and serve to play the fool, to cash in on the inner and outer storms. So here in the last two stanzas, we see we see that we see that he is presenting a complex attitude to poetry. Here we understand that his approach to poetry is rather pragmatic. He says the inner and the outer storms are not to be seen as problems to be solved. It is not a measure of one's wisdom to solve them. The wisdom is actually playing the fool, yet cashing in on these inner and outer storms. So making best of all those difficulties. The wisdom is in playing the fool, yet cashing in on these inner and outer storms by making them the subject of one's creativity. He can cash in on his own difficulties, the difficulties he had gone through. He understood, he became wise enough to cash in on all the traumatic experiences he had gone through. So, this is the way he responds. He says that how now he has become more mature, and how he uses these experiences as a subject of his creativity. He continues, the Indian landscape sears my eyes. I have become a part of it to be observed by foreigners. They say that I am singular. Their letters overstate the case. I have made my commitments now. This is one, to stay where I am, as others choose to give themselves in some remote and backward place. My backward place is where I am. So here in this stanza, he sums up the his socio-political stance. The poet overcomes his anguish by formulating much plainer view, much simpler view, by wisely accepting. He has attained this wisdom to accept the paradoxes of life, the contradictions of life, to accept all those inner and outer storms. So inner storm is his own inner conflict, and outer storms is conflict with the society. So he wisely accepts the paradoxes of life, making the best out of both this inner and outer storms. He accepts this Indian landscape in spite of the irritation which it has been causing him. That is why he says, Indian landscape sears my eyes. Though it burned my eyes, I have become part of it. So these last lines reinforces the idea that this poet is determined to stay in India, and that too with a sense of deep commitment, not resentment. In the beginning, we see a poet with whole lot of resentment. Now we see a poet who is so committed to this nation. So this poem is the way it frames this question of identity, and the poem gradually sets out to solve this puzzle, the question of identity. He says that he wisely accepts this as part of his life, and most importantly, he affirms that he belongs to this place. There is a sense of belonging he has developed in respect to this country of his birth, which is also seen in one of his other poems, like titled Island, in which he says, I cannot leave the island. I was born here and belong. So there is this shift from self pity, self alienation, to the acceptance of the actualities and ordinariness of life. And he firmly fixes his identity in a backward place. So here in this poem, so it is a kind of resolving this puzzle, and later he points out this ambivalence in the identity of the self. He accepts this ambivalence in the identity of the self, yet he concludes by saying that yet he is committed to India, as although it is a backward place, he claims it to be his home finally. So here ends this analysis of the poem titled Background Casually. Please go through the poem once more and listen to this lecture. Hope it is clear. Thank you, girls. Have a nice day.